This is part two of the rise of democracy in the United States. And earlier today, we spoke about these topics, democracy and the different types, the founders and how scared they were that you might wind up with some people who had an inordinate amount of power, people like Daniel Shays historically, or maybe Joe McCarthy in the 50s. We also went over what a republic is and that there were some positives and some negatives to a republic. Then we took a look at how policy gets implemented, which really brings us to our next topic, which is the distribution of power in our system. And as you can see, it's all about politics. Politics, the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate between parties having power. That's the key to politics. You're going to have these different groups that are going to debate, and when they reach agreement, we get policy. So let's take a look at some of the different views that exist when it comes to the distribution of power in our system. And we're going to start with a really good one. It's called the majoritarian politics view. And basically what it says is that we, the people, have a voice. And when enough of us say something, politicians will work to implement that into policy, that they will do what we want them to do. Now, sometimes the majoritarian view works. Other times there may be other interests that make it so that the majoritarian view doesn't work. And we're going to take a look at some of those now as we transition to the elite politics view. And there are different types of elites out there. We're going to start with the economic elites. So I'm going to ask you for a moment to think about somebody that is very wealthy. Okay, not Chris Cizal. That's the correct answer. But if you were thinking of someone who is very wealthy, you might think about maybe Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, or another group or a couple of people who are brothers, and they're known as the Koch brothers. This website, by the way, that I'm showing you right now, Open Secrets, we will spend a lot of time here. They track money. They are not liberal. They are not conservative. They just track the money. The idea of the economic elites is that they, because they are economic elites, are going to be able to influence policy more than the average person. And you can see it says profile for the 2014 election cycle. So the 2014 election cycle began on January 1st, 2013, and it will end December 31st, 2014. It is a 2-year period. And during this time, this group has spent over $2,664,000 in contributions, plus another $10 million in lobbying. And you can see that they have a political perspective. You'll notice that for the most part, they are giving money to conservative causes. The Koch brothers support conservative causes. But here's what I really wanted you to see for a moment. The top candidate recipients. And you're going to notice that there are 5 politicians who have received money from the Koch brothers and their interests. And the first one there is Mike Pompeo, if that's how he says it. And this one makes sense. The Koch brother industries are located in Kansas. But here's the deal with the economic elites. The idea is that if they have given all of this money to politicians, when they have an issue, if they have a concern, they will be able to pick up the phone, call these representatives, and the representatives will take the call. I would love to think that if I picked up the phone and called representatives, they would take the call from me. The reality is they probably would not. So that is the idea of the economic elites. The next is the power elites. And this really was first brought up by Dwight David Eisenhower when he talked about the military-industrial complex. And what he basically was warning us is that we have transitioned from a nation where originally, if we needed war materials, our people built the war materials, and then after the war was over, they went back to the private sector and did their farming or whatever else they did. However, because we have been involved in we were involved in 3 of the 4 wars of the 20th century, that at that point in time at least, that due to that, we have built a permanent military complex. The military is always looking for new technology. And he warned us that when people are constantly looking for new innovations and saying that we need the latest and greatest thing to be able to be secure, that there become interests involved and that we're not doing things necessarily only for the security of the US, but that you might wind up with the private sector, the people who build the weapons, and the public sector, the military who's going to finance the weapons, working together. And if you take all of that money and put it towards those interests, it's going to be very difficult to fund other things. So Eisenhower, as he's leaving office in 1961, warns us of this military-industrial complex. Now, our next one is called the bureaucratic view. And the bureaucratic view is kind of one I like. I think it's kind of funny. These are the people who lead the cabinet in the United States today. They are the head of huge organizations. And since we just mentioned the military, we can take a look at the Secretary of Defense. His name right now is Chuck Hagel. And Chuck Hagel oversees the Pentagon and is in charge of the U.S. military around the world. So he has a pretty big job. What the bureaucratic view says is that in reality, these people aren't all that important, that they will come and go. If we looked at these people when President Bush was in office, they would all be different. When we look at them again after the 2016 election, when a new person will be president, they will all be different. So the bureaucratic view says they're not all that important. The people who really matter are the career workers under them. So if you go to any of these agencies, like the Attorney General's office, which is in charge of the Justice Department, that when you look at the people who work for the Justice Department across the United States, they will be there before Eric Holder got there, while Eric Holder's there, and way after he is gone. And the people who do day-to-day work are the people who actually run things. It's great to put a new head on top, but that head can be swapped out with another head at any point in time. I know it's going to sound weird, but let's just look at Secretary of State. Picture John Kerry as the head of the State Department. And the body of the State Department is going to be all the people who work for the State Department. So you've got John Kerry's head and a body underneath it. Well, before John Kerry became the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. So Hillary Clinton's head was on top of that body. You take off Hillary Clinton's head, you put John Kerry's head on top of that body. The body stays the same, the head changes. The head doesn't really control the body. The body does what it wants. So the bureaucratic theory really says that the people who work in the agencies are going to be able to get things done whenever they want. Now, when we look at these economic elites, there is a concern about the economic elites in particular that I want to talk about before we move on to the pluralist view. And that is that their money will buy them that access, that their money is going to allow them to make campaign contributions. Now, with all the different rules that have come out since the Citizens United decision, which we will study later, they will be able to spend huge sums of money on behalf of candidates running for office. And as a result, they are going to influence policy in ways that had not been done before. Okay. Now, our next view is the pluralist view. The pluralist view is actually a happy view. The pluralist view says you got lots of groups out there. So because there are so many, no one group has control over everything. So no one elite group can control everything. Therefore, when you're going to get policy, it is going to be a result of compromise. Now, we have had a very interesting time in the United States in the last couple of years where you've had a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic President. And they have not gotten along really well. Yet here you go, on August 11th of this year, the president signed a new VA health care law because a problem had been identified, and regardless of whether you were a Republican in the House or a Democrat in the Senate, you recognized that the problem was real, and they worked together and compromised in order to try to improve the situation for our veterans. So the pluralist view is a really positive view. Our next view is not. It is called the interest group or hyperpluralist view. And once again, here we are back at Open Secrets. And what you find is that we've got all of these interest groups. We can look at it by industry, we can take a look, but all of these have interest groups. So let's take a look at labor. Here are a bunch of different labor interest groups and the amount of money that they have contributed during this election cycle. And they are going to be pushing for an agenda. So now that was going to be labor. Let's look at, let's try business. Well, businesses, well, you can see the red and the blue. So you got a lot of red there. I was going to look for one that might have a lot more red. Oh, let's go defense. Okay. So you can see in the defense, a lot of money going to Republican causes. So you have some groups giving money to Democratic causes, some groups giving money to Republican causes. And what hyperpluralism says is that because of this, compromise is impossible, and instead we wind up with gridlock, and we are unable to act. And what you find is that Congress has basically been labeled this time the do-nothing Congress because they have not been able to reach many agreements. And you can see on the chart, as of right now, 142 laws have been created by this Congress. The Congress before, which also was seen as a do-nothing Congress, 283. But then you start looking back and you're going to see that 283 was a new low, and the 142 where we are today, unless there is a major passing of legislation in the short term when they come back from recess, we are not going to see many laws enacted. So because interest groups are fighting with each other and they have so much influence over the members of Congress, we wind up with nothing being done. Now, moving on, just some vocabulary to introduce it to you today. We're going to talk about things that are fundamental to our process, fundamental democratic processes. And we start with a very important word. It is called legitimacy. Legitimacy, you can see the definition. Basically what it means is that laws are created properly. We elect people to government. Those people hear our concerns, they debate policy, they vote on policy, the policy abides by our Constitution, the president signs that policy into law, and therefore because it was done properly, we, the people, will comply with it. That's the idea of legitimacy, that you do things through the proper process. Another fundamental piece for us is free and fair elections. We have wound up with a two-party system. I will say this again, but I sincerely do not believe that our founders ever thought we were going to have a two-party system. They thought it was going to be regional parties, and you might have a Northeastern party, a Mid-Atlantic party, a Southeastern party, a Western party. They did not necessarily see the two-party system coming, but that's what we got. And for us, the important part here is we, the people, have a right to vote. Elections are free and open to U.S. citizens to vote and choose those people whom they want to represent them. Free and fair elections. Third, majority rule with minority rights. This was very important when we created the nation. You have two groups. I like to refer to them as the haves and the have-nots. The haves were the property owners. They were the people who owned wealth. The have-nots were everybody else. Now, as you might imagine, there were a heck of a lot more have-nots than haves. If you look at B above it, all of a sudden we're about to have free and fair elections. If all you do is say the majority wins, then you could see the majority vote to take away all of the property of the minority. The have-nots could gang up together and basically rob everything from the haves in society. So when we create our country, we make sure that there will be protection of property rights, of minority rights. In the early times, it was about specifically property. Today, it could be the voice of people, that you have a right to express your opinions even when they may not be popular, which brings us to the next two, freedom of expression and the right to assemble and protest. Freedom of expression basically means that you can say what you want as long as it does not incite violence and is not considered hate speech, which we will cover in detail at another time. But you're pretty much allowed to express yourself as long as it doesn't infringe upon the rights of another physically, or you are asking someone to hurt another person. And probably the best example I can give you of this is a group called the Westboro Baptists, who have protested at different funerals many times for soldiers who died on a battlefield. And they believe that the soldiers died because America allows homosexuals to exist in society. So they have protested against at the funerals of people who died. And by the way, the soldiers were not gay. They had nothing to do with being gay. They died on a battlefield, but the Westboro Baptists say they're dead because we allow homosexuality in the country. Now, most people will probably find that point of view pretty offensive, but under our First Amendment, they have the right to express themselves and they have the right to assemble and protest. And as long as they are not physically trying to hurt another person, as unpopular as their message may be, they are still protected to deliver that message. Our last section of this lecture is about democratic structures, and there are 4 terms here that we will revisit quite a bit. The first one is one of the major terms of this course. The term is federalism. Federalism is a division of power between different levels of government, specifically between the national and the state governments. The national government has their powers, the state government have their powers, and the two run side by side historically. Now, there is overlap that we will get to, but for our purposes today, federalism is a division of power between the national and the state governments. Another fundamental democratic structure is separation of powers. When we started our nation, we decided to have 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The legislative branch's job is to make the law. That's their responsibility. The executive branch is to enforce the law, to make sure that the nation is compliant with the law. And the judicial branch is there to determine whether or not the law violates the Constitution. So as a concrete example, if you go back to 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education, you'll remember that in that decision, the Supreme Court said that schools must be integrated. A few years later, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor of the state refused to allow Central High School to integrate. At that point, President Eisenhower, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, had to, or well, he did have to, if he was going to enforce the law, send in the U.S. Airborne to make sure that the desegregation or the integration of that school did take place. The president's job is to enforce the law. The last, next to the last part is checks and balances. And believe it or not, making law in the United States is really, really hard. You've got to have lots of victories, and only one time does someone have to say no for it basically to be a no. But just some quick examples. Let's say the House passes a bill. The Senate is an interbranch check. They could say no, bill's dead. However, let's say the House and the Senate agree and they both pass a bill. Well, then it goes to the president, and the president could say no. Now, if the president says no, the House and the Senate can vote to override his veto. But to override a presidential veto takes 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, and is very rare. As a matter of fact, in the history of the United States, roughly 93% of all vetoes stand. So if the president says no, odds are the answer is no. Let's say the president signs a bill into law. It sounds good. There still is one final check. If someone in society feels that they have been wronged by this law, they can challenge that law in court, and eventually that law could make its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And even though the House of Representatives said yes, the Senate said yes, and the President said yes, if 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court say no, the answer is no. The the only real check on the Supreme Court is to amend the Constitution, and you can see how often that happens. The last part of our lecture here deals with the word constitutionalism. And what this term basically means is that for us, everything is written in a constitution. And all laws that are enacted must abide by that constitution. That is one of the reasons we do have a Supreme Court, to make sure that laws that are created do not violate the United States Constitution. So, that's it. Tomorrow when you come into class, if you have any questions about what I went over, please, please ask. I will not bite. If something was not clear, I'll be glad to go over it again. This is a different way of trying to do things, and I want to make sure it works for everyone. So that's it, and that brings this lecture to an end.